Miff loudly belched from the couch where he sat next to me, and then scratched his little hairy fairy belly. We were both exhausted. We had spent the last several months training me to become a hunter. I've learned a lot about the Fae and cryptids. Do you know the main difference between Fae and a cryptid? It's people. According to Miff, at least, human imaginations carry with them a power of manifestation. That's right, manifestation. It's not only for yoga podcasts and sexy hippies. Specifically, a cryptid is a fae, or spirit, that in some way interacted with humans. Once this interaction occurred, however, stories of that fae must then be told and retold. Every iteration of the original encounter causes the storied fae to slowly gain a physical manifestation in our realm. They will continue to manifest and evolve in our world with a direct correlation to the stories being told about them. The reason other fae, like fairies, pixies, etc., stay as fae is because their stories are told addressing them as the fae they are. So first, I want to tell you about a new creature I recently saw. It was a Playboy bunny wearing a scandalous parka that lives in my house. Tell everyone you know. Secondly, I have a new house guest. Her name is Brookie. She's a brownie. Not like the edible confection, but the fae, a tiny winged housekeeper. Her goal in life is to serve, to create a pleasant space for owners of a house. The only issue with having a brownie in your house is you must thank it for everything it does. Should you not, your adorable, friendly, and helpful brownie could become upset enough to become a boggart or a gremlin. Well, Brookie isn't my first brownie. My first brownie moved in while I was in the Fae realm with Miff when he broke my neck. Asshole. I guess I'll start my story from there. Once we finished introducing me to my new Fae powers, Miff brought me back to my house. Miff dropped in and landed softly on my bed. I came back to the human world about a foot next to my bed, dropping an elbow WWE superstar, gone A-list actor Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson would have been proud of, straight onto my nightstand. Given the angle at which I fell, hitting my elbow made me also punch myself in the face. Miff's laughter was salt in the wounds. Sometimes I want to light him on fire when I think back on it. I wonder if he'd blow up like a firework. At this point, I was honestly out of energy. Since I woke up, I've read the Bible, showered, crab walked, fell off my dresser, met a fairy, pissed off a fairy, got banished to the Shadow Realm, Fae Realm, if you're slow, got hired by the fairy broke my neck, and then unbroke my neck, told me I have superpowers, and that I was basically like Deadpool's own Spooderman. Deadpool? Probably. And then he dropped me on my nightstand, and I punched myself in the face. I was pretty much done, and passed out right there on the floor. I woke sometime later to the sound of glass sliding across my bedroom floor. I lifted my head off my arm pillows, noticing the wet feeling of drool on my cheek and forearm. I wiped them dry with my blanket that was hanging off the bed next to me where I slept. I heard glass sliding across the floor again. Was it my cat playing with the glass? I flopped over, too sore to try any graceful movements, and said, "Hey, Bob?" "Oh, fuck off," as I rubbed my eyes. When I opened them, a tiny little lady with light brown hair and big pretty eyes was standing in front of me. She was about as big as Miff and stared at me intently as if considering what I said. A frown slowly began spreading across her face. A sing-songy voice projected from above me. "Oh, he didn't mean it." It was Miff. "Thank you for helping." He jumped off the bed and landed on my head, grabbing my earlobe and aggressively whispering, "What the fuck do you think you're doing, Ash? That's a brownie. Are you trying to die?" The brownie looked at Miff, smiled, bowed, and then went back to moving the glass around. I swatted Miff off my head and sat up, looking around the room. It was spotless. "Hey," I said to the brownie, "did you do all this?" I said, motioning around the room. She looked at me and nodded. A little smile that reached her eyes made my heart flutter. "Oh," I said in reaction to her cuteness, a dumb smile now occupying my mouth. "Thank you." She curtsied and went back to cleaning. Miff was now hovering next to my head, and he grabbed a handful of my hair. "That is a brownie, Ash. Do you know what a brownie is?" The annoyance in his voice wasn't subtle. Before I could answer, he continued, "A brownie is a fae that is here to help you. She will clean up after you, bring you knickknacks, and do little things that make your day better. Sounds pretty awesome, right?" he said, finally releasing my hair. Rubbing the sore spot on my head, I replied, "Yeah, actually, that sounds pretty nice." Miff nodded as he agreed, then said, "Well, here's the thing. She's one of the most dangerous fae to humans. If you don't thank her, or if you make her upset, she can very easily lose herself and become a boggart or a goblin. Miff didn't take his eyes off her as he spoke. Why would she turn into a goblin? I said, then moving on to my next thought. I barely noticed if I forgot to eat, let alone little odds and ends that might get changed. I wore my worry on my face, apparent by my puckered eyebrows. Well, it sucks for you, Miff exclaimed. You can't ask her to leave without offending her, and then you run the risk of her turning. Oh, I said. Yeah, Miff said. Just then my cat came into the room. The brownie saw her and disappeared in the blink of an eye, the piece of glass she was moving now spinning where it was left on the floor. My cat's name is Bob. When I first got her, I couldn't decide on a name. I decided to name her Bob as a placeholder until I found a better one, but Bob stuck. So now I have a girl cat named Bob. Bob is a long-haired calico. She's about 3 years old, and I've had her since she was but a wee babe. Bob walked over to me and nuzzled my leg. She lovingly looked up at me, and then looked past me, and locked on to Miff. Miff froze as he stared at her. Oh no. Oh no, Miff mumbled under his breath in astonishment. A low growl crept out from deep within Bob's chest. I looked up at Miff and he actually looked scared. Glancing back down at Bob, she was all floofed up, super floofy. I never seen a cat more floofier than her. Another low, drawn-out escaped Bob. Then, Bob became the bestest and then worstest kitty ever. Everything that followed happened in slow motion. She sprinted up my lap and up my chest, scratching my nipple as she used me as a springboard to get to Miff. Bob was fully extended, claws out, as she came after Miff's head. A smile was now spreading across my face. Miff was frozen in place. Was that fear? Bob reached Miff in the blunkt of an eye and swatted the shit out of him. Like NBA All-Star and big tall man Shaquille O'Neal dunking a ball in his prime. Bestest cat. Miff rocketed to the ground, and guess who was trying to sneak out of the room? Well, none other than our new brownie. Miff descended on her like a comet, and of course he hit her, because why not? And they were both sent tumbling and sliding across the floor into the glass that was neatly stacked. Worstest cat. I caught just a glimpse of Miff's eyes in the slow motion moment. Concern, anger, and guilt were written all over his face. Time resumed and Bob landed on the bed and then dashed out of the room. Miff and the brownie smacked the wall. Miff quickly rose to his feet and screamed for me to run. The brownie stood up and then doubled over. She made an eerie series of short, low grunts, like a 6-year-old summoning their inner darkness to destroy the kid on the playground that told them their mom was a stinky face. The brownie heaved, her breaths getting deeper and longer as her delicate frame began to stretch and tear. Miff was yelling something at me, but I was absolutely transfixed on what was happening in front of me. I don't think it was even fight, flight, or freeze. I was just awestruck. What the fuck is that? I quietly gasped. Your mother, Miff replied quietly this time, realizing we were trapped. What does it fucking look like? It's a goblin ash. I was still catching up with all this mystical shit. I watched her skin grow taut, and then it tore. She unleashed anguished growls and retaliation. Her flesh bulged as her bones grew from underneath the now translucent sheet of her skin. She was so bloody. She grabbed fistfuls of her hair and began violently tearing her hair out. I don't think that was enough, though, because she began pounding on her head with her fists, screaming louder. Blood poured from her eyes, ears, and nose. Her screams were wet and bubbly from the fluids collecting in her throat. She stumbled around blindly, reaching out with one hand until she found purchase on the doorframe. Digging her nails into either side, she braced herself, threw her head back, and then slammed her head against the corner, over and over and over. Her head started falling apart. Bits of bone and flesh began falling all around her feet. The cracks and squelches did little to mask her growls. She was still growing. From beneath what remained of her head, I noticed a seeping, fanged, screaming monster, slick with blood, veiling itself. Miff grabbed my head. Ash! He screamed, Move! He threw me on my feet. The goblin finally stopped beating its head against the door frame and slowly looked over its shoulder to stare at us. Even though it was a little less than half my size, I knew I was nothing but prey. The low, raspy growls never stopped as it took deep, steadying breaths. A raw rage burned deep in its pink, beady eyes. Miff, I whispered again, not taking my eyes off of it. Miff, do the magic thing. Right now, please. I can't, Miff softly croaked. I used up all my juice jumping back and forth between the realms. Fuck, I whispered. Yeah, he replied. The goblin roared and lunged at us. Miff pushed me over and hit my elbow on the nightstand again. Ow! Fuck you, Miff! The goblin soared between us, smacking the wall on the far side of the room. I screamed like a very big manly man and sprinted towards the new opening, the bedroom door. Miff was right behind me. We broke out of the room at full tilt and went careening down the hallway. Like the goblin, we also smacked the wall. Owie. We instantly shoved ourselves off the wall and began running down the shorter hall to our left that led to the kitchen. The goblin launched into the wall that we had hit just half a second ago, and it broke into the drywall. It let out a scream like a pig being roasted alive, which sent chills through my loins. We tumbled into the kitchen just as the goblin regained its footing and continued its pursuit. Grab a weapon! Miff yelled, grabbing my paring knife off the counter and wielding it like a sword. I panicked and just reached for whatever was behind me, not even looking because I was watching the entryway for the goblin to come barreling in. And just as I found something, it came in. Miff wasted no time and screamed courageously as he dove down and buried the paring knife deep in its foot, pinning it to the floor. Now! Miff directed me. I knew what he wanted me to do. I used what was in my hand and slammed it over the goblin's head, squinting through my war cry. A large cloud of white erupted from what I had grabbed. It was flour. I hit the fucking goblin with a 2-pound bag of fucking flour. The goblin roared in pain and fury, and I fumbled blindly for another weapon. My fingers closed around the handle of a heavy skillet, and without hesitation, I swung it with everything I had to the goblin's head. The skillet connected with a sickening thud, sending the creature teetering backwards, but it did little to deter its furiosity. With a snarl, the goblin ripped the knife out of its foot, sending droplets of blood spattering across my kitchen floor. Miff darted around the creature, his wings buzzing frantically as he attempted to distract it, giving me a brief window of opportunity. I seized a cast iron pot from the stove, hurling it towards the goblin's head as hard as I could. It crashed against the creature's skull, causing it to elicit a guttural growl of pain. But the goblin was relentless, its eyes glinting with malice as it lunged towards us. Miff danced nimbly out of reach, but I found myself cornered against the counter with nothing but a wooden spoon in my hand. As the goblin closed in, I swung the spoon with everything I had, which wasn't much at that point. You can't do much with a wooden spoon. I struck it across the face, yeah, but it was like a little like a pap. Anyway, it pissed it off. Enraged, the goblin snatched the spoon from my grasp, snapping it in half with its bare hands. Miff darted forwards, his tiny form a blur of motion as he slashed at the goblin's ankles with his makeshift sword. But it shrugged off the attack, its attention fixated solely on me. With a surge of adrenaline, I grabbed a handful of spices from the nearby rack, flinging them into the goblin's eyes in a desperate bid for escape. It howled in agony, clawing at its face as it stumbled backwards, temporarily blinded by my special attack. Seizing the opportunity, Miff swooped in, his paring knife glinting in the prismatic color shift of his wings. Despite his best efforts, however, he failed to deliver the final blow to the goblin's heart. He was instead backhanded by the flailing goblin and sent ruthlessly crashing through the pantry. The goblin stopped clutching at its eyes after a moment, and slowly it looked up at me, eyes narrowed and swollen. With a bone-rattling scream of unbridled fury, the goblin descended upon my picturesque body. I put my arms up to cover my face, but because the goblin was so short, all I really did was fully expose my tummy to it. The goblin's claws tore through my flesh. Primal fear gripped me, twisting my insides like icy tendrils of terror. Or maybe those were fingernails. The kitchen seemed to shrink around me, as the stench of my blood filled the air. With each blow, I resisted less, and yet the pain intensified. I could feel bones snapping underneath the force of the goblin's assault, sending shockwaves of agony reverberating through my core. I dropped to the ground like a sack of tomatoes. As I lay broken and bleeding on the kitchen floor, a strange sensation began to wash over me. It was as if the very fabric of reality were unraveling, leaving me adrift in this sense of semi-consciousness. I watched as the goblin drew back for another strike. I knew this was the end. No hope of survival in the face of such relentless cruelty. Taking a final glance back at Miff, I realized he was still fighting the goblin with everything he had, while I lay bleeding out on the kitchen floor like some baby that Humpty Dumptied itself into a meat grinder. It took everything I had just to watch Miff, but I'm glad I did. For the first time since meeting Miff, he actually looked like a badass. I watched him rise off the counter still holding his makeshift sword, and then he tossed it into the air and it spun like 2 or 3 times, and then he caught it by the blade, reeled back, and threw it with amazing precision. The knife buried itself deep in the goblin's skull, and the goblin's head whipped sideways from the impact. It didn't kill it, though. Everything was screaming now. Miff and the goblin were pissed, and having a good old-fashioned scream-off. I shit myself during the panicked moments, and I just realized it. And Bob was the hero. She came sprinting into the kitchen from the living room, still super floofed, and she sprinted at me, and then used my body as a springboard to lunge at the goblin's neck. She nailed her target. She tore a little chunk out of its neck. A copious amount of blood boiled forth from the wound, and Bob disappeared back into my room. The goblin was furiously screaming and clutching at its neck now, trying to stop the blood. It stumbled on its once impaled foot and began to reach out blindly for balance. The flour was mixed with the blood and quickly turned into a crusty crimson dough. Its eyes were sealed shut by the forbidden strawberry cake batter, and Miff wasted no time taking advantage of the opening. He flew up high above the goblin and then dove back down through its skull. Several deep, squishy thuds were heard as Miff continued through its body, his little war cry quickly dissipating within the chest cavity. The goblin stood still for another moment, obviously confused about what had just happened. It took a step forward towards me, took 2 steps backwards, and then fell forward on its face, no longer moving. It was dead. Hey, Miff, you alright? I paused for another moment and listened, and then I noticed something moving at the goblin. What the fuck? The muffled scream of a distressed Miff resonated from its belly. Miff? Miff? I chuckled as I put a hand on the goblin's back. I felt Miff in there. Push like that again, I heard him say. It moved me a little bit. I think I can see the way I came in. I pushed again and the foulest odor flooded the room. I instantly threw up. Then I caught my breath and turned back towards the goblin. And I pushed on its back again. Also again at this moment, realizing my body was put back together. You know, honestly, I wish I had a camera. Miff did find a hole. He mostly made it out. It wasn't the one he entered through, though. Miff was sticking halfway out of the goblin's ass. Like, one arm was freed, while he wriggled the rest of himself out. Miff wouldn't stop, angrily screaming as he squeezed himself out. Diarrhea on cotton candy looks absolutely vile, by the way. After dumping all my body wash on Miff and hosing him off in the garden, we returned to the dead goblin. It laid in a crusty concoction of blood and flour, which adhered to the floor. With some effort, we scraped it off the kitchen floor and buried it in the backyard. After the grueling events of the day, I was ready to collapse. But there was one more surprise waiting for me on my bed. Have you ever loved something so much that you just know it's around you? Like how parents can tell it's their kid based off of some hunch. Well, I had that happen to me, because sitting on my bed was Bob? Kind of? She wasn't a cat anymore. She looked kind of like the goblin. She lost some hair, her proportions were all weird, and she looked like she could stand up if she wanted to. She hopped off the bed and slowly approached me, her eyes locked on mine and her head dropped. Was I going to have to kill my fucking cat? Slowly she stalked closer, my fear rising with each step. Was this it? The moment I thought I'd never have to experience? The moment I kill my best friend? Nope. Bob trotted right on over to me and gave me a pretty mighty head boob kind of thing and started purring. I think it was purring. It sounded like an ogre gargling marbles. I reached down hesitantly, though, and scratched her scaly head. She happily meowed. But that was all fuckered up, too. It was like a baby inhale crying. It was an awful noise. Well, that's my cat now. My lumpy cat goblin. My domesticated face Scorn. A goblat? A cablin. Cablin. I like cablin. Oh yeah, and Miff came in and freaked out, and I told him to leave her alone, and after watching us for a while, he agreed to let me keep her as long as she behaves. So if she starts to act more like a goblin, though, he'll have to kill her without mercy. Until next time.